Have you ever wondered what could make battle-hardened soldiers who survived the bloodiest trenches of the Great War freeze in absolute terror at the sound of a single bark in the darkness? Before we dive into this classified chapter of military history that governments tried to bury for decades, I need your help. Comment below where you are watching this from right now. This channel depends on viewers like you to keep bringing these secret stories to light. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about warfare. The first reports arrived at German High Command headquarters in Cologne on October 17, 1917, typed on emergency dispatch papers marked with the highest classification level. Major Klaus Reinhardt, a decorated officer who had commanded troops through 3 years of the Western Front's worst carnage, wrote something that his superiors initially dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by combat stress. His hands trembled so violently as he typed that several keys jammed, leaving dark smudges across the page like bloodstains on snow. "The American lines have deployed something unholy," he wrote. "Something that moves through no man's land like death itself has taken physical form. My men call them Höhlenhunde, hellhounds. 3 of my best soldiers, veterans who never flinched under artillery bombardment, threw down their weapons and ran screaming into the wire last night. 2 are still babbling incoherently in the medical tent. The 3rd shot himself rather than face another night in the trenches. This is not cowardice. This is something far worse. This is primal terror." The document sat in a dusty file cabinet in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg for nearly 8 decades before a graduate student named Friedrich Wolff stumbled across it while researching his dissertation on psychological warfare tactics. What began as academic curiosity transformed into an obsession that would consume the final 6 years of his life. Wolff discovered that Reinhardt's report was not an isolated incident, but rather the first documented encounter in what would become a systematic campaign of canine psychological warfare that the United States military had secretly developed in training facilities hidden deep in the mountains of Colorado and Virginia. The program's origins traced back to a chance observation made by Captain Thomas Blackwood of the American Expeditionary Forces during a reconnaissance mission near Verdun in March of 1917. Blackwood, a former police officer from Philadelphia who had trained tracking dogs for law enforcement, noticed something peculiar in the behavior of German sentries whenever American patrols brought their messenger dogs close to enemy lines. The Germans, who had their own robust war dog program, showed none of the calculated tactical responses they typically demonstrated against conventional threats. Instead, they exhibited what Blackwood described in his personal diary as an almost superstitious dread. "I watched through field glasses as a German patrol encountered one of our messenger dogs in a shell crater," Blackwood wrote in an entry dated March 23, 1917. The dog, a mixed-breed shepherd barely trained for its duties, did nothing more than bark and hold its ground. But the reaction from the Germans was extraordinary. They did not shoot, they did not advance, they retreated, firing randomly into the darkness, their movements panicked and disorganized. One soldier crossed himself repeatedly. "I realized then that we had stumbled upon something the enemy feared more than our bullets." Blackwood's report made its way through military channels until it reached the desk of Colonel William Mitchell, an innovator known for his unconventional tactical thinking and his willingness to explore psychological dimensions of warfare that more traditional officers dismissed as unscientific. Mitchell had been studying reports from the British and French about the demoralizing effect that unexpected sounds and movements had on entrenched troops suffering from what doctors were only beginning to understand as shell shock. He saw in Blackwood's observations the seed of something potentially devastating. Within 6 weeks, Mitchell had secured funding and authorization to establish Project Cerberus, a classified program headquartered at Fort Logan in Colorado. The name was chosen deliberately, invoking the mythological guardian of the underworld's gates. Mitchell recruited Blackwood to lead the training operations alongside 3 other officers who had experience with working dogs. Lieutenant Robert Hayes from the New York Police Department's K-9 unit, Captain James Morrison, who had trained avalanche rescue dogs in the Swiss Alps, and Lieutenant Sarah Thornton, one of the few female officers in the American military at the time, who had worked with herding dogs on her family's ranch in Montana. The selection criteria for the dogs themselves became a subject of intense debate among the team. Traditional military wisdom favored breeds known for their obedience and discipline: German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, Doberman Pinschers. But Thornton argued forcefully for a different approach, one rooted in an understanding of what created visceral fear in humans. She had observed during her childhood that the dogs which frightened people most were not always the largest or most obviously aggressive, but rather those whose appearance and behavior triggered deep ancestral memories of wolves and wild predators. "We need dogs that look wrong," she wrote in a memo that survived in declassified files. "Dogs that move wrong, dogs that sound wrong." The German soldiers have been conditioned to view dogs as either servants or equals in the military hierarchy. We need to break that conditioning. We need to tap into something older, something that existed in the human psyche before we ever domesticated the wolf. We need to remind them what it felt like when our ancestors huddled in caves while hungry things circled in the darkness outside. The team began acquiring specimens that met Thornton's unsettling criteria. They sought out dogs that exhibited what behavioral specialists would later term uncanny valley characteristics, animals that were clearly dogs, but possessed features or behaviors that seemed somehow off, somehow other. They found a breeder in Wyoming who specialized in producing German Shepherds with unusually pale eyes that reflected light in a distinctly unnerving way. They located several animals from failed breeding programs that had produced dogs with atypical vocalizations, barks that sounded less like domestic canines and more like the howls of wolves or the screams of wounded animals. One dog in particular, registered in training documents only as Subject 17, became the template for what the program sought to achieve. Subject 17 was a large male shepherd mix with a coat so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His eyes were mismatched, one brown and one blue, with a clouded cataract that gave it a milky white appearance. A birth defect had left his facial structure slightly asymmetrical, creating an expression that humans instinctively read as malevolent or untrustworthy. Most unsettling of all was his voice. When Subject 17 barked, the sound emerged as something between a bark and a growl, with an undertone that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that triggered immediate anxiety responses in anyone who heard it. The training regimen developed over the summer of 1917 focused not on traditional attack or patrol techniques, but on psychological impact. The dogs were taught to move in specific ways that maximized their threatening presence. Low stalking approaches with minimal sound, sudden explosive movements from concealment, and most effectively, what the trainers called the freeze, a behavior where the dog would remain absolutely motionless in a threatening posture while maintaining unwavering eye contact with its target. This last behavior proved particularly effective because it violated the expected patterns of animal behavior. Soldiers trained to respond to attacking threats found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty when faced with a predator that neither attacked nor retreated, but simply watched and waited. Hayes contributed techniques from his police work, including the strategic use of barking as a psychological weapon. The dogs were trained to bark in irregular patterns that prevented humans from habituating to the sound. Just when the enemy troops would begin to adjust to a certain rhythm, the dogs would fall silent. Then, from a different location, the barking would resume with altered pitch and timing. Sleep deprivation, Hayes understood, was as effective as any bullet in destroying an enemy's will to fight. By September of 1917, Project Cerberus had produced its first operational unit, a pack of 23 dogs designated as the first Special Canine Company. The handlers were selected from volunteers who demonstrated both exceptional skill with animals and a willingness to participate in operations that existed in a legal grey area under the conventions of warfare. The handlers understood that if captured, they might be treated not as prisoners of war, but as participants in illegal warfare, subject to immediate execution. The first Special Canine Company deployed to France in early October, attached officially to the 26th Infantry Division, but operating under separate orders that came directly from Mitchell's office. Their mission parameters were unlike anything in standard military doctrine. They were not to engage the enemy directly. They were not to capture or hold territory. They were instead to haunt the German trenches like ghosts, to become stories whispered in the dark, to transform the mundane act of standing watch into a test of psychological endurance. The tactics employed were deliberately designed to blur the line between reality and nightmare. Under cover of darkness, handlers would position the dogs at irregular intervals along contested sections of the front. Sometimes the dogs would be audible but invisible, their barks and growls echoing from shell craters and ruined buildings without any visible source. Other times, they would remain completely silent while positioned just beyond the range of lamplight, pale eyes reflecting back at sentries like disembodied spirits. Lieutenant Hans Weber, a 24-year-old officer from Stuttgart, kept a detailed journal that provided one of the most complete German perspectives on these operations. His entries from late October 1917 documented a rapid descent from professional military confidence into something approaching psychological collapse. October 19, Weber wrote, "Reports continue of American dogs in no man's land. Command insists these are merely messenger or patrol animals, nothing to concern veteran troops. I have instructed my men to ignore such superstitious nonsense. We have faced poison gas, flamethrowers, and tanks. We will not be intimidated by dogs." October 22. I must revise my previous assessment. Whatever is in the wire, it is not behaving like any military working dog I have encountered. Tonight, Corporal Schmidt spotted one approximately 40 meters from our position. He raised his rifle to fire, but something about the animal stopped him. He described it as having a face that did not look quite right, eyes that seemed to glow with their own light, rather than merely reflecting our lamps. The dog did not move. It did not bark. It simply stared at Schmidt until he lowered his rifle. Then it vanished into the darkness so quickly that Schmidt questioned whether it had been there at all. October 25. The men are exhausted. None will admit it openly, but they are terrified of night watch duty. The dogs appear without warning and disappear just as suddenly. They never attack, which somehow makes the situation worse. An attacking dog can be shot. A watching dog, one that seems to be studying us with an intelligence that feels wrong, creates a different kind of fear. Private Müller requested transfer to a different section of the line. I denied the request because I cannot afford to lose men to what may be nothing more than American messenger dogs displaced by artillery. October 28. Something happened tonight that I cannot explain in terms that will not make me sound insane. I was inspecting the forward observation post when I heard Schmidt screaming. I ran to his position and found him pressed against the trench wall, rifle on the ground, staring at something in the darkness. I saw it then, a massive black dog sitting at the edge of our wire, perfectly still. Its eyes were wrong, mismatched colors that reflected our lamplight in a way that made them appear luminescent. But what disturbed me most was its expression. Dogs do not have human expressions. They cannot. Yet this animal wore something on its face that I can only describe as knowing. It looked at us not with animal instinct, but with calculated intelligence. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound that was not quite a bark, not quite a howl, but something in between that seemed to resonate in my chest like the vibrations from heavy artillery. Schmidt grabbed his rifle and fired 3 times. He is an excellent marksman. At that range, he should not have missed. But when the shot stopped echoing, the dog was gone. No body, no blood. No sign it had ever been there except for paw prints in the mud that were too large to come from any dog I have seen. I have requested relief from this section. My request was denied. Command believes I am exaggerating the situation. Weber's final journal entry, dated November 2nd, 1917, was discovered by American forces when they overran his section of the trench 3 weeks later. The handwriting deteriorated from his earlier precise script into something barely legible, the letters sprawling and irregular, as though written by someone whose hands would not stop shaking. "They are not dogs," he wrote. "I do not know what they are, but they are not dogs. Tonight I watched one move through the wire, and it was wrong. The way it placed its paws, the angle of its joints, the rhythm of its breathing. Everything was slightly incorrect, like watching a puppet master who has studied dogs but never truly understood them. And the sounds, God help me, the sounds they make. We can hear them all night now, circling our positions, calling to each other in voices that sound like men imitating dogs, rather than dogs being dogs. Private Richter shot himself an hour ago. He left no note, but before he did it, he kept repeating that he could not spend another night listening to them, that he would rather die by his own hand than wait for them to come closer. I did not stop him. I am a coward. I understood exactly what he meant. The psychological impact documented in Weber's journal was replicated across multiple sectors of the Western Front throughout the winter of 1917 and 1918. German military records, declassified in the 1990s, revealed that psychiatric casualties in units facing American positions, where Project Cerberus operated, increased by nearly 200% compared to other sectors. Medical officers reported unprecedented numbers of soldiers exhibiting symptoms that did not fit established patterns of shell shock or combat fatigue. These men spoke of persistent nightmares featuring dogs with human eyes, of waking hallucinations where they saw canine shapes in every shadow, of a creeping paranoia that the animals were somehow coordinating their movements with supernatural intelligence. Colonel Mitchell, monitoring reports from the field, recognized that the operation had exceeded all projections for psychological effectiveness. But he also began to notice something disturbing in the reports from the handlers themselves. Lieutenant Morrison filed a classified memo in January of 1918 that raised questions about whether the program was affecting more than just the enemy. "The dogs are changing," Morrison wrote. "When we first deployed them, they responded to commands and exhibited normal canine behavior between operations. Now, something is different. They seem to understand the fear they create. Worse, they seem to enjoy it. Subject 17, in particular, has begun exhibiting behaviors that I cannot explain through normal animal psychology. He anticipates commands before we give them. He positions himself in locations that maximize psychological impact without any direction from his handler. Last night, I watched him study a group of German prisoners through the wire for nearly 10 minutes, absolutely motionless, before turning away with what I can only describe as satisfaction. Several handlers have requested transfer from the unit. They report nightmares where the dogs speak to them in human voices, where they reveal themselves to be something other than animals temporarily employed in military service. I recommended psychological evaluation for these men, but I must confess that I have experienced similar dreams. More troubling still, I am no longer certain they are dreams. Mitchell suppressed Morrison's report and replaced him with a more compliant officer, Captain Richard Walsh, who had no previous experience with working dogs, but possessed an unquestioning dedication to completing assigned missions regardless of ethical considerations. Under Walsh's command, Project Cerberus expanded its operations and intensified its tactics. The dogs were deployed in larger numbers and encouraged to approach closer to enemy lines. Some handlers began leaving the animals in no man's land for entire nights without supervision, trusting them to return at dawn. The dogs always returned, but according to several accounts preserved in classified files, they often came back with mud on their paws that suggested they had traveled far beyond their assigned sectors. Corporal David Brennan, a handler from Boston who worked primarily with Subject 17, kept an unofficial diary that he hid among his personal effects. His daughter discovered it decades after his death and donated it to the National Archives in 2003. The diary entries from February and March of 1918 painted a picture of a man increasingly disturbed by his own role in the program. February 9th, Brennan wrote, 17 did something tonight that I cannot rationalize. We were positioned near a German listening post when he suddenly moved forward without command. He disappeared into the darkness for perhaps 20 minutes. When he returned, I heard German voices shouting in panic. Then silence, complete absolute silence. 17 sat beside me and looked at me with those mismatched eyes, and I swear before God that he was proud of himself. Not in the way a dog is proud when praised by its master, but in the way a person is proud when they have accomplished something they planned and executed independently. February 23rd. I requested transfer today. Captain Walsh denied it. He said I was too valuable to the program because 17 responds to me better than other handlers. This is true, but it is not a comfort. 17 does not respond to me the way a dog responds to a handler. He tolerates me. He chooses to cooperate. I have trained dogs since childhood, and I recognize the difference between obedience and partnership. What 17 and I have is neither. It is something else entirely, something that feels less like I am commanding him and more like we are collaborating on something I do not fully understand. March 7th. The other handlers are talking. We do not speak about it in official reports or where officers might overhear, but in quiet moments we share our concerns. We all feel it. The dogs are not quite right anymore. They watch us sometimes with expressions that seem to contain complex thoughts. They coordinate with each other in ways that suggest communication beyond normal pack behavior. And they are getting bolder. Yesterday, Sergeant Cooper's dog, Subject 9, approached a wounded German soldier in no man's land. Cooper expected the dog to attack or at least threaten the man. Instead, Subject 9 sat down next to him and simply stared. The German began screaming. He screamed until his voice gave out, and then he continued to scream silently, his mouth open and his face contorted in absolute terror. Subject 9 never touched him, never growled, never showed aggression. He just sat there and stared with patient, almost gentle attention until the German's heart gave out from sheer fright. Cooper reported this as a successful psychological operation. The rest of us know better. That was not a military dog executing its training. That was something else wearing a military dog's shape. The breaking point came in late March of 1918. Though the full story remained classified until documents were released under the Freedom of Information Act in 2011. A German raiding party managed to capture Private James Holland, one of the newer handlers, along with his assigned dog during a night operation near Cantigny. German intelligence officers, desperate to understand the psychological weapon that was destroying their troops' morale, brought both Holland and the dog to a military research facility near Charleville-Mézières. What happened in that facility over the following 72 hours was reconstructed from the journal of Dr. Ernst Volkmann, a military psychologist assigned to interrogate Holland and study the dog. Volkmann's journal, discovered in a storage facility in East Berlin in 1991, provided the only detailed account of events that German High Command subsequently ordered expunged from all official records. March 26, 1918, Volkmann wrote, The American prisoner is remarkably forthcoming, perhaps because he seems relieved to be away from his assigned duty. He claims the dogs are part of a psychological warfare program designed to terrorize our troops. Simple enough on the surface. But his descriptions of the animal's behavior suggest either elaborate exaggeration or something far more disturbing. The dog itself is secured in a reinforced holding area in the basement. A large male shepherd mix, unremarkable in most respects except for its eyes, which are indeed unsettling in their mismatched coloring and intense focus. The animal has not eaten, drunk, or eliminated waste in the 36 hours since its capture. It simply sits in the center of its cell and watches whoever is assigned to guard it. 3 different soldiers have requested relief from that duty, claiming the dog's stare makes them feel physically ill. March 27th. Something extraordinary and deeply troubling occurred last night. I was working late in my office, which shares a wall with the holding area. At approximately 2 in the morning, I heard the dog begin to vocalize. But the sounds it made were unlike any canine vocalizations I have encountered in my research. The sounds shifted in pitch and rhythm, almost as though the animal were attempting to form words. Impossible, of course, yet I found myself straining to understand what it was trying to say. More disturbing was the reaction of the guard, a veteran soldier named Hartman. I found him the next morning sitting outside the holding area, staring at the wall with tears running down his face. When I asked what had troubled him, he said the dog had been talking, not barking or howling, but talking, speaking in a voice that sounded like his dead brother, who was killed at Verdun 2 years ago, calling his name, asking him to open the door. I have sedated Hartman and referred him for psychiatric evaluation, but I must confess that I heard something myself during those dark hours. Something that might have been my mother's voice, though my mother died when I was 7 years old. Something that knew my name. March 28th. The situation has deteriorated catastrophically. At approximately 4 this morning, I was awakened by screaming from the holding area. I arrived to find the night guard, Private Schneider, huddled in the corner of the corridor, babbling incoherently. The door to the holding cell was open. The dog was gone. I organized an immediate search of the facility, but we found no trace of the animal. What we did find was far worse. The door to the holding cell showed no signs of forced entry from the outside. The locking mechanism had been opened from the inside, not broken, not forced. Opened with the key, which was discovered on the floor of the cell itself. Private Schneider, once we managed to calm him sufficiently to speak, claimed that the dog had called to him using the voice of his daughter. His daughter, who lives in Hamburg and whom he has not seen in 18 months, the dog told him that she was sick, that she was dying, that she needed him to come home, and to come home he needed to open the door. So he did. He unlocked the cell, took 3 steps inside, and then realized what he had done. The dog walked past him without aggression, almost gently, and disappeared into the facility. I have reported this incident to command as an escape facilitated by psychological breakdown of the guard. I have not mentioned the voice. I have not mentioned the key. I have not mentioned that when we searched Schneider's pockets, we found a letter that had arrived that very day from Hamburg, informing him that his daughter had fallen ill with influenza. A letter he had not yet read. March 29th. The American prisoner Holland died last night. The medical examiner could find no cause of death, no wounds, no signs of illness or poisoning. His heart simply stopped. But before he died, he managed to write a message on the wall of his cell, using his own blood. The message read, "It knows the way home now." I do not understand what he meant. I am not certain I want to understand. The dog has not been found. German troops in the area have reported sightings of a large, dark animal moving through the rear areas, always at night, always alone. 3 soldiers have been found dead with no apparent cause, their faces frozen in expressions of such profound terror that even hardened medical personnel found the sight disturbing. Command has issued orders to shoot the animal on sight, but no one has managed to get close enough to take a shot. I am requesting immediate transfer from this facility. I can no longer sleep in a building where something walks the corridors that can open locked doors and speak with the voices of the dead. Volkmann's transfer was approved, and he was reassigned to a field hospital near the Swiss border. The facility near Charleville-Mézières was evacuated and subsequently destroyed by German forces during their retreat later that year. Official records attributed its destruction to American artillery, but declassified documents revealed that the demolition was deliberate, ordered by German High Command with specific instructions that the basement levels were to be sealed with concrete before the explosives were detonated. The dog from Volkmann's account, which American records later confirmed was Subject 17, reappeared at American lines 6 weeks after its capture. It walked into the camp at Fort Logan, Colorado, on a Tuesday morning in May, more than 5,000 miles from where it had last been seen in France. Corporal Brennan was among the first to see it, and his diary entry from that day captured the profound wrongness of the situation. 17 came back today, Brennan wrote. I do not know how he crossed an ocean. I do not know how he found his way to Colorado from France, but he walked into camp this morning as though he had simply been on a routine patrol. He looked at me with those mismatched eyes, and I knew with absolute certainty that he had learned something during his time with the Germans. Something that changed him in ways that go beyond anything we intended when we started this program. Colonel Mitchell ordered a full veterinary examination. The doctors could find nothing physically wrong with the dog, though they noted in their report that his behavior seemed more controlled and purposeful than before his capture. Mitchell ordered Subject 17 returned to active duty. That decision would prove to be a catastrophic mistake.